applying to do a PhD and said, would you mind writing me a reference? And he very sweetly said, well, of course I'll write you a reference, but don't you think you'd be better off asking somebody more senior? And given the stellar career that he's had since, I have often smiled over that incident and thought, if you said now, I asked Matt Saunders for a reference, and he said maybe you should ask someone more senior, you would sort of wonder, whom should I ask for him? I would really struggle to find anybody more senior than you. The formal background to that, I'm sure I don't need to tell, many of you at least, so that certainly the modernists among you will know the same very well, as will the life writers. We have autobiography fiction in the library. It's that colossal one that needs a shelf for itself. He is interdisciplinary professor of modern literature and culture at the University of Birmingham. From 2012 to 18, he was director of the Arts and Humanities Research Institute at King's College London, where he co-directed the Centre for Life Writing Research. He studied at Cambridge and Harvard, was a fellow of Selwyn College at Cambridge, is the author of Ford Madox Ford, A Dual Life. 2 volumes it says here. It's the one that's always described as magisterial whenever you come across it in other people's work. And self-impression, life writing, autobiographiction, and the forms of modern literature. His book Imagined Futures, Writing, Science and Modernity in the Today and Tomorrow book series 1923 to 31 was published by OUP in 2019. He's co-editor with Sarah McDougall of Alfred Cohen, an American artist in Europe, Between Figuration and Abstraction. He has already contributed to the Kent Maps site, so I'm sure many of you will have seen his contributions on there. His Alfred Cohen entry is actually on our front page, so go and have a look again, not now, but later, if you haven't seen, there are some really pictures on there, which is what happens, of course, when you commission an artist. So do go and look on the Kent Maps online site. Max is going to speak to us now on coastal landscapes in Ford Madox Ford and Alfred.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for such a kind introduction. And thank you too for the invitation to join this symposium today. I've had a wonderful time listening to all the papers. It's been really fascinating, such an amazing range of topics and interests. I've learned a lot about Kent and a lot about maps today, and the intersections are amazing. So in 1915, the novelist Ford Madox Ford was writing wartime propaganda, but not what we usually think of as propaganda, the rubbishing of the enemy's war effort or anything like that. Instead, he was doing something much more oblique. Effectively, it was a kind of cultural propaganda, and it was a continuation of what Ford had always argued for and always would, an appreciation of French culture, and particularly French writing, as the type of what he called conscious art. The great French writers, for him especially Flaubert and Maupassant, weren't the storytellers and entertainers dear to British hearts like Dickens and Thackeray. They were masters of form and technique for Ford. And the second of his 2 propaganda books, called Between St. Denis and St. George, and then it came out in 1915, must be the only propaganda book, I think, to include a detailed analysis of how to translate the opening of a story by Flaubert. Hardly the way to win a war, you would think. And just after he does that, Ford tells a story of his own about when he was living in Kent near the Channel coast and working with a handyman to break a window through the wall of a cottage. And I wanted to start with this because it really sums up a lot of what I want to talk about today. So the quotations there on the slide: "It was not until we had well squared out the space into which the window frame would go," says Ford, "that I stepped back into the room, much as an artist steps back from his canvas to consider what might be the view that we'd opened up. The room was lowish, coolish and rather dark. The day was astonishingly bright. It was one of those days when the sun diffuses an almost painful light from a blue sky that is like polished metal, whilst underneath it ran a cruel east wind. And suddenly, in a square before the eye, hung a most astonishing picture, a belt of painfully vivid blue, a belt of painfully vivid pink, and above the pink another belt of blue. And in the belt of pink, which was formed by the French cliffs, there were nacreous markings, for all the world like the little ruddled and bluish shadowings of pink mother of pearl. They were the Cathedral of Boulogne and the houses of Boulogne and the column that Napoleon I erected to commemorate the invasion of Great Britain, an invasion which of course never happened, even though the monument was built for it. And Ford goes on to say, times in which France, as it were, seems to come into England are not unchronicled in history. I keep finding myself drawn back to this extraordinary passage, and each time see something different in it or through it. It's certainly an instance of what Ford calls the double civilization that he always advocated, wanting French and English to communicate with each other at a really deep level. And it's also a bit, an image of how his vision is always one of the linguistic and the cultural being framed by the aesthetic, I think. I mean, he stands back as if an artist looking at his canvas as he looks through this window that's been opened up. It's also a very impressionist vision, impressionist in palette certainly, in its attention to light, colour and atmospheric perspective. It's a view of the kind of coastal scene beloved of the Impressionists, even if the French coast is seen from a greater distance than normal. But it's also impressionist in its abstraction. Even post-impressionist, we might say those belts of painfully bright colours are more de Stael than Monet. The effects are heightened and exaggerated as post-impressionist painters tend to go in for. So one can say all those kinds of things about it, but of course, in the context of today's frame, I think the first thing to say about it is that Ford's cottage is definitely on the Kent map, in the village of either Bonington or nearby Aldington on the edge of the Romney Marsh in the late 1890s. I say this because sometimes, like Ford and my other subject today, the painter Alfred Cohen, I'll need to outrage the Kent fundamentalist among you and stray into Sussex a bit, but this definitely is Kent, except of course that it's also France, which is why my title is Coastal Landscapes, the Kent coast as a prime example of the coastal landscapes on both sides of the channel, looking at each other. Ford wrote a lot about Kent and the Romney Marsh, particularly in a book called The Heart of the Country, from 1906, part of an important trilogy about England and the English. Sorry, I was trying to give you a picture of it, but it looks like it's not displaying. Anyway, we'll see if the next one's any better. He had earlier written this book, the one called The Cinque Ports. So I was interested to hear about Elizabeth Owen's foreword to a later book on that subject. And of course, it's wonderful to be talking to an audience where I don't have to explain what the Cinque Ports are. In fact, this one is one of the least known of Ford's 80 or so books, but it should be of great interest to Kent mappers, I think. It's beautifully written and also wonderfully illustrated by the artist William Hyde with very delicate engravings, such as this one in the frontispiece of Dover. Ford also wrote a poem called Aldington Knoll, and another called A Great View, which I've given you on this slide, probably about the same place, in which it's too long to read out, but what clinches the greatness of the view there is the fact that it's another vision of France across the water. You know, that if you get high enough on this hill, you can see right across the channel. Now, in 1915, when he wrote that propaganda book that I started with, Ford was based in London, but spending a lot of time at Selsey on the West Sussex coast, I'm afraid, although it may have reminded him of his earlier views of the Channel. But in fact, his attachment to this part of the world goes back much further. As a child, a Londoner, he'd been sent to school in Folkestone, phew, Kent again, folks, a school called Pretoria House, run by a couple named Pretorius. And here it is in probably more detail than even the most fundamentalist Kentist could desire. Alfred and Elizabeth Pretorius, who ran the school, were Germans from Frankfurt. She'd been a star pupil educationalist Froebel, who pioneered the kindergarten. And they ran their school on extraordinarily cosmopolitan lines, having classes one day in German, another in French, and then another day in English. And the school was chosen for young Ford and his brother, probably because it was very, very much their background. Their father was another German immigrant, Franz Hofer, who was a great champion of Wagner and became music critic of the Times eventually. And Ford's mother, Catherine Madox Brown, was the daughter of the pre-Raphaelite associate Ford Madox Brown. Ford Madox Brown had actually been born in Calais and was brought up shuttling between Kent and Normandy. So you could say Ford Madox Ford, his grandson, had this Kent coast cross-channel sensibility in his blood, certainly in his family history. In one of his later memoirs, he recalled, "When I was a boy, my grandfather, who was French by birth and had a strong French tinge to his English, used to say to me, 'Fordy, you must speak French with absolute correctness and without slang, which would be an affectation, but with the strongest possible English accent to show that you are an English gentleman.'" When Ford was living in Kent and later at Winchelsea, he continued writing about the area and especially about the people he met there. He said that he hardly saw anyone but field workers when he was living at Bonington for about, 6 years. And he was to write movingly about them in The Heart of the Country and in several later books. There was the hard-working ragged arse Wilson, so called because of the frailty of his nether garments, said Ford, and who was singularly handsome, dark, with a little beard like Shakespeare's and that poet's eyes. And there was Shaking Ben, who'd been ruined by the bad girls of Rye. But above all, there was Mary Walker, of whom Ford said, "I think I cared for her more than for any friend I've made before or since." She was much older than Ford, and someone who'd spent all her life living on the land. Her one unfailing form of words, he said, was, "I keep all on going." And that was at once her philosophy and her reason for existence, wrote Ford. And those words came back to him whenever he felt his struggle to find new forms of words was failing, and he needed a reason for his own existence. Apart from those local friends, Ford had been dependent on visits from literary people for news of the cultural life of the capital. And in 1898, he and his wife, Elsie, decided on a change of scene, and they rented a cottage in Limpsfield, Surrey, near Ford's London friend, Edward Garnett, whose wife, Constance, was the great translator of Russian literature of the age. Edward worked as a publisher's reader and had been sent the manuscript of the first novel by the Polish emigre, Joseph Conrad. So Garnett soon introduced Conrad to Ford, and it would prove the most significant literary friendship of Ford's life. They decided to collaborate on a novel that Ford had drafted about a Kentish man, John Kemp, getting abducted by pirates. And it was published in 1903 as Romance. But Ford and Conrad continued to collaborate over a decade altogether. Ford and Elsie returned to Kent in 1899, and this was the year when they moved to Aldington, the village just next door to Bonington. And then again in 1901, they moved to Winchelsea, very nearly in Kent. Much of the collaboration happened there, but also in the Kent farmhouse that Ford and Elsie had been living in at Postling, near Hythe, but which Ford then, with characteristic generosity, gave to the Conrads to live in. And it's still there with a plaque to Conrad on it. There it is, although weirdly it's been turned into an airfield nowadays. And the two men, as I say, collaborated for a decade, producing 2 novels and a novella together, Ford helping Conrad with a lot of his other books. For example, the story Amy Foster of Conrad's about an Eastern European sailor washed up on the coast after a shipwreck was inspired by a story of Ford's that appears in the book on the Cinque Ports. Conrad shared Ford's passion for French literature, and they would discuss for hours what would be le mot juste for the kind of blue tinge of the cabbage field and other Kentish sights. Their ideal for prose was a kind of English that felt as if it had been translated from French. Remember the essay on how to translate Flaubert. It was one of those days when the sun diffuses an almost painful light from a blue sky that is like polished metal. It doesn't quite sound like English, that. Perhaps has the same French tinge as Ford Madox Brown's English. Ford thought it the highest compliment when another writer, John Rodker, described his best-known book, The Good Soldier, from 1915, as the finest French novel in the English language. It wasn't just Conrad that Ford was seeing in Kent at this time. If his contacts in Bonington had been mostly with the local peasant men and women, at Aldington he found himself in a group of some of the finest writers of the age, who all happened to be living within a few miles of each other. Apart from Conrad, there was Stephen Crane, the American, and his wife Cora, who'd taken on an ancient stone manor house, Breed Place, between Hastings and Rye. Henry James was living in Rye too. Ford had met him when he moved to Kent, but James hadn't paid much attention then, had thought him a sort of descendant of the Pre-Raphaelites, and that was all. He was very solicitous about both Conrad and Crane, though, and he had much more time for Ford now Ford was moving in their company. There was also the nature writer from Argentina, W.H. Hudson, who would come to visit them, and H.G. Wells, who lived at Sandgate, who also became a close friend of Ford's at this time, and described the other members of the group as a ring of foreign conspirators plotting against British letters. The Kent and Sussex countryside had become an intensely literary landscape. Even the local grocer took a great interest reading his customers' books and discussing them when they came in to buy stuff. What Wells meant about the ring of foreign conspirators was that just as the anarchist exiles that Conrad would write about in The Secret Agent and Under Western Eyes, and whom Ford had sort of lived with at Limsfield, which was known as Dostoevsky Corner there because a lot of the Russians came to stay near the Garnets. So the writers wanted to overthrow the literary establishment rather in the same way. They had revolutionary designs on literary form and style. They were the avant-garde of literary modernism. Their fiction, the first stirrings of its experimental techniques and formal provocations. And their models, as I've suggested, were the great French stylists of the 19th century. Ford was actually the only British-born writer of the group, but his German father and French-educated grandfather had left him in an ambivalent relation to Englishness, at once a dream case of it and someone feeling alienation from it all the time, which made him want to dissect it all the more, as well as exemplify it all the more. The shared commitment of this group to a French precision and formal mastery was, H.G. Wells implies, deeply un-English. But Ford understood they had something else in common. What made their writing so fresh and direct was that instead of being aware of a wise or witty authorial voice like Dickens's or Thackeray's telling us a story, spinning us a yarn, we're being shown something. What's being presented is not a sequence of events seen externally by an omniscient, objective narrator. Those events, the stories, are seen as if by one or more of the characters. It's as if we have a direct access to what they perceive and what they think. These men all wrote about quite different subjects in different styles, but their writing took you closer to the experiences they described. Reading Crane gave Ford the sense he knew what the American Civil War had been like. Reading Conrad gave a sense of what it would be like to keep a ship from wrecking in a typhoon. Or reading James gave a sense of what it would feel like to notice very slight changes in the behaviour of those around you and gradually realise from them how people had been conspiring to manipulate you for your money. When he read Hudson's description of lying on his back on the South Downs, watching the thistledown being carried in the warm air overhead, Ford paid the greatest compliment he knew. He said, Hudson looked up into the perfect limpid blue of the sky and saw, going into infinite distances, one behind the other, little shining globes like soap bubbles. They were thistledown, floating in an almost windless heaven. Now that is part of my life. I've never had the patience, the contemplative tranquility to lie looking up into the heavens. I've never in my life done it. Yet that is I, not Hudson, looking up into the heavens. So Hudson's prose gave such a strong impression of having the experience that it seemed to Ford like an experience he had had himself. You can see the problems for his literary biographer. Ford remained in the countryside among these writers for a decade around the turn of the century. At the time, he didn't have a label for them, though he saw that they had a shared aim to create innovative, serious art. And he was to write much about this period of his life and his literary friendships from the 1920s onwards. There's a beautiful book about Conrad called Joseph Conrad, A Personal Remembrance, from 1924, which gives the most inward account of their collaboration. And in it, he names the individual critical topics they discussed, things like how to render conversations, how to create surprise in a novel, the importance of style, their development of the time shift, and so on. But after Romance was published in 1903, Ford was increasingly concerned with the idea of impressions and how to present them and construct books around them. And he went on increasingly to identify himself and the other members of the group around the Romney Marsh as what he called impressionist. It wasn't a label James or Conrad used of themselves exactly, though they both saw the impression as absolutely central to what they were doing. But it's one that critics have started to take seriously again now. You can find a lot of books about literary impressionism, which will put all these writers and others together. Ford enlisted immediately after his 1915 novel, The Good Soldier, was published. He arrived at the Western Front in the middle of the Battle of the Somme and was shell-shocked and suffered lung damage. After the war, he needed to recuperate and found a cottage auspiciously called Red Ford near Pulborough, again in West Sussex, not far from the coast, and he was living there with the Australian painter Stella Bowen. After 3 cold and muddy winters, they borrowed a friend's villa on Cap Ferrat on the Mediterranean and decided to stay in France, splitting their time between Provence and Paris. But Ford continued to write about his time in Kent and Sussex in a series of books of reminiscence, including that wonderful portrait of Conrad. But he also wrote about it in Parade's End. This was his series of 4 novels about the war. And much of the first volume, some do not, detailing the pre-war world mainly, is set around the Romney Marsh and Rye. The first half ends with an extraordinary sequence in which the protagonist, Christopher Tietjens, meets Valentine Wannop. They're diametric opposites in many ways. He's from the landed gentry, a Tory civil servant. She's a suffragette, the daughter of a novelist. But they're both very intelligent and they're attracted to each other. They carry on arguing as they drive a horse and cart through the magically silver night mist and are inevitably falling in love as a car looms out of the mist and smashes into them. Stella Bowen, Ford's partner at the time, made the jacket illustration that you can see there and chose that scene for it, making Tietjens and Valentine look very like herself and Ford. Both the writing and the image suggest what a powerful romantic hold the area still had on Ford nearly 20 years after he left it. And it's a very striking vision of Kent, I think, but one of the striking things about it is that it isn't the most familiar vision of the county. I've been thinking a lot about chalk today, from Peter's fascinating talk about the literary geology of the area this morning onwards. And I'd always thought of my Kent childhood as a reasonably happy one, but now I realise I was sorely deprived. I never got to play in a chalk pit. We heard how rich the Kent landscape is as a source of feelings about history and culture. And I suppose the most famous example that's been touched on a few times already is the White Cliffs of Dover. When the BBC did a dramatisation of Parade's End in 2012, They included a beautiful panorama of that view as a setting for a fraught scene between Tietjens and his wife. Diana Hurst quoted Elizabeth Bowen's phrase about Kent's dramatisable coastline, and this was a tremendous example of that in a way. But what the scenery in that episode of the television series said was that this is about England, about Englishness, an image of fortress Britain standing up against European enemies in the war, or that kind of thing. And it tends to play to the kind of insular nationalism that came to the fore during the Brexit referendum, of course, with the Kent coast very much posed in that rhetoric as the front line. But that's very decidedly not what Ford does in Parade's End, and indeed not in that scene in Some Do Not that was being filmed on the Kent coast, because actually in the book, the scene isn't set in Kent at all, it's in Yorkshire. And Tietjens' characteristic taciturnity and obstinacy are defined much more in terms of local regional identity rather than national. Ford's Kent is certainly saturated in history, but in a much more sort of granular and deep way than that. He recalls in the Cinque Ports the ancient etymologies of the place names, and Christopher Tietjens and Valentine Wannop argue about that when they're on that dogcart ride. But again, what that does in summoning up the Anglo-Norman roots is again to present the whole area as saturated with a European history, not just an insular English one. Now, I'd come across Ford as a student through working on Ezra Pound. Ford had discovered and published Pound when Pound was in London before the war, and Pound remained fiercely loyal. And as I became further immersed in Ford, it turned out there were a number of overlaps with the other person I wanted to talk about today, my stepfather, the painter Alfred Cohen. The overlaps were to do with Paris, where Ford lived after the First World War and Alfred lived after the Second. They even lived in the same artist colony on the Boulevard Arago. But it was also Hemingway, introduced to Ford by Pound and taken on by Ford as assistant editor of the magazine he was publishing, the Transatlantic Review. Alfred, too, was American. He had served in the US Air Force during the war and studied at the Art Institute of Chicago on the GI Bill afterwards, and won a traveling fellowship which took him to Paris. The crowd of American expats he knew there in the 50s were all obsessed by Hemingway, frequenting his cafes. Here's a picture of Alfred on the left, leading exactly that life, sitting outside one of those cafes with one of his paintings and with an English painter friend. The Hemingway aficionados even travelled down to Pamplona each year for the bull run, and Alfred did that too, producing some superb lithographs of bullfights. And indeed on one trip there, he was even introduced to Hemingway, who happened to be in Spain back again for the first time since the Spanish Civil War. And they were all absolutely kind of fascinated to meet him and talk to him. Alfred was charmed by Paris and painted it as few artists can resist doing. It was fairly unscathed by the war or modern redevelopments, so it looked still very like Hemingway's interwar Paris. This is the Place Dauphine, still one of the most sort of charming, unspoilt squares in the city. But then in 1960, Alfred moved to London and started painting the Thames in a much more modern way, though still influenced by the Impressionists that he'd been trained very much sort of in the style of in the Art Institute, which is full of the most amazing Impressionist masterpieces. And his career really took off in the 1960s. The actor Anthony Quinn had become a close friend. Alfred had painted his portrait back in Chicago in the 40s when he was visiting there, playing in Streetcar Named Desire. And Quinn introduced him to a lot of film people. And they started buying his work. Stars and producers came to his exhibitions and created a stir, and the pictures sold out. He then turned to a very theatrical subject, perhaps influenced by all these people, the Commedia dell'arte. And he painted another sellout show on that theme in 1963. But then suddenly his life took a rather different direction. He'd met my mother and they decided to settle down. And they couldn't afford to buy a studio in London, so started looking in the country, finding an old coach house in Kent that would convert into perfect studio space. They were packing up to move the next day when they heard the news on the radio of Kennedy's assassination. So Alfred swapped the hothouse art world of the city for rural life. It wasn't isolated exactly. London was only an hour and a bit away by car, and dealers and picture buyers would come to visit for a day in the country. But apart from the war years, he'd only ever lived in cities: Chicago, Paris, Heidelberg, London, and Kent village life was very different. Ford later described himself as buried in the countryside when he was living in Kent. He suffered from depression at that time. His marriage began to fail. The strains of working with Conrad brought on a nervous breakdown. In retrospect, you can see why it hadn't seemed a happy time. He still loved the landscape, but you can see why that view of France, the prospect of an escape, seemed so appealing. For Alfred, the Kentish landscape felt equally immersing, but in a good way. And that's the main area of overlap, my reason for putting the two together in this talk. I mean, that and the fact that when Carolyn invited me to write for Kent Maps, they seemed the obvious two figures for me to write about, the two I'd worked most on, for whom Kent was such an important part of their life. And that's the point, really. It's about the impression that their lives in Kent made on them and the impression it made on their art. Here's Alfred talking about the experience of being immersed in Kent. It was Kent, he said, that engaged my feelings more fiercely than any other place I can remember. What hit me was an incredible feeling of privacy. Driving along a country road, I felt the hedges crowding in on me. The leaves were so thick that they were like a wall. We passed a hedge cutter, and he glared at us as if we'd interrupted some ritual. Then he stepped down into the ditch and disappeared, as though he'd been absorbed by the landscape. Everything was so impenetrably all over green that I could think of no way of getting into it as a painter. The way I'd been working simply wouldn't do. And here in this painting, hedge cutting and harvesting is perhaps that hedge cutter almost disappearing into the darkness of the hedge. Living there made all the difference, Alfred told the journalist Philip Oakes. I realised that the landscape had no dominant features, no crags, no gorges, no rocky escarpments. Everything was reduced in size. The fields were small. The villages were built in sheltered folds, tucked out of sight. The people and the places related to each other. The men who lived and worked there seemed to me to fit their environment as naturally as the pegs securing the tiles to the roofs. To make sense of it as a painter, I had to reorder what I saw. I had to separate the elements to isolate the component parts. And I think you can see something of what he is talking about in the picture showing now, which is called near Goudhurst, the village that we moved to, where that coach house was. As Philip Oakes goes on to explain, he evolved a new style using paint like a sculptor, laying down slabs of colour, carving it with his brush so that the fields and hedges and houses seemed to be hewn from the canvas. Painting certainly became more heavily worked, with more impasto from the mid-1960s, with many of the effects achieved, as here, by working the paint with a palette knife. Many of the best works of this period are small, semi-abstracted and perfectly harmonised compositions, often with red sunsets bringing out the warm earth colours, or evocative dusks with deep green foliage. We lived there for 15 years altogether, in a series of houses my parents converted to Alfred's designs. So as with Ford, Kent and its varied topography was to become a major part of Alfred's life and of his work. The parallels between Ford and Alfred hadn't really been so apparent to me until I wrote about them both for Kent Maps. I'd been doing a lot of research on Alfred's biography as well as his paintings over the last few years, because 2020 was his centenary, and we had a series of exhibitions planned. Of course, it turned out to be the worst year to have your centenary, and they all had to close during the pandemic, though luckily The three of them in Norfolk, where my parents moved in 1978, will be able to reopen. There are ones at the Sainsbury's Centre and the Alfred Cohen Art Foundation in Whiton in May, and the one at the Castle Museum in Norwich in July. The biggest of the exhibitions was in London, at King's College London. Unfortunately, we can't open that to the general public again, though we can admit people by invitation. So if anyone particularly wants to come and have a look, do let me know and I'll be glad to make an appointment for you. But luckily we were able to film the exhibition and put it all online. And you can find it on the website shown here. It was done as a collaboration with the Ben-Uri Art Gallery and Museum and is beautifully presented on their website too. Alfred's work in the early to mid-1960s, during his first few years in Kent, certainly reflects that sense of immersion in his immediate environment, I think. I've often wondered if Frank Auerbach saw this picture when it was exhibited in London in 1964, because it certainly seems to have a lot in common with some of his pictures of Primrose Hill, although you can see his style becoming much sort of wilder and rougher than Alfred's. And that sense of abstraction that you can see in a painting like this goes through the painting of that period. And I think it's, I mean, you sometimes see the villages seen through trees, as here in a picture which I think shows the influence of Samuel Palmer too, a painter who Alfred really admired. But also he began to return to the Channel coast, seen from both sides. He painted it a lot when he lived in France, but he started again from England, but painting it in new ways. The art critic James Burr noted in Apollo, many subjects have engaged the expressionist fervour of Alfred Cohen. In these recent paintings, the boats and houses of the coastlines of France predominate. He reacts with a fierce passion to direct experience that is organised into a formal structure. His emotional power and exuberantly vigorous response infuses his paintings with an intensity that makes much contemporary expressionism look feeble. And it was this return to coastal paintings that was really to characterise much of his later work from the later 60s and into the 70s and beyond, though actually that too was a theme there right through the whole of the 60s, as for example in this work here, the Warmer Lifeboat and the Goodwin Sands from 1964. It's a characteristic example, I think, and one that brings out what James Burr was talking about there, how a Cohen landscape is never just a charming view. It's very much concerned with structure, as Ford was with form, with how you represent a view, how you construct it, how you frame it. And again, like Ford, he's very much in communication with French and European art rather than British. A work like this is aligning itself with German expressionism, as Burr suggests, with French post-impressionism, with the abstraction of painters like de Stael with Rothko even, rather than the British landscape tradition, though he certainly had a great admiration for Turner. And what I wanted to point out in this example is the way he takes the window frame. I mean, in one sense, this is just a view looking out through a window, but he uses the way the window frame is divided in two to divide his own composition in two and to paint the two halves rather differently. You've got the more representational left-hand side with the lifeboat in the middle and the houses and the grass in the foreground. But then on the right, you have something which, again, is still recognizable as representational. You've got the sunset and the sea and the sky, but it's very abstracted. And with that series of internal framings, which, yes, represents the window frame, but seems to go within the window frame to produce painted frames inside that, on one of which he writes the title. And that divides the picture up in different ways, which seem to me very reminiscent of Rothko, who Alfred was also fascinated by at the time. Sometimes the coastal pictures have generic titles, and it's impossible to locate them on either side of the channel. This one, for example, is simply called Coastal Picture. Or in another example, this one is called Small Haven. And again, note the frame within the frame. But also how the cliffs in these two pictures aren't this sort of titanium white, dazzling cliffs you might expect. But you've got a lot of different tones and hues within the chalk of the cliffs. They contain incredibly variegated colours. If you remember Ford's description of the colours of the French cliffs with their nacreous markings and the blue shadowings of pink mother of pearl, I mean, you've got the blue and the pink in there, and a sense of green as well. Not representing the cathedral and the column of Boulogne as in Ford's example, but just the blue sky and the red sunset touching the white of the cliff with tinges of colour. More often, Alfred's coastal scenes include boats and ports, both flying flags, as here. Flags, of course, are potent symbols, and Alfred was as critical as anyone of the flag waving associated with toxic nationalism, whether American or British. What his pictures often do is include flags of several different nationalities, and sometimes even flags of none. Part of the appeal for him of living abroad was the detachment it gave him from both the America he'd come from and the France and Britain he'd been living in. He said of Britain, "I don't want to leave it. America is no longer my home. I feel more of a foreigner there than I do anywhere in Europe." That was at the end of 1968, at the height of the Vietnam War, and after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. But note how he doesn't say he didn't feel a foreigner in Britain, but that he feels more of one in America. And also note how he doesn't say that he felt more of a foreigner in the US than in Britain. To say in Britain that you don't feel a foreigner in Europe was always to suggest that you did feel a bit of a foreigner in Britain, even before Brexit. And this, of course, was written even before Britain joined the European Economic Community, as it then was, in 1973. So what I want to suggest then is that the plethora of flags in Alfred's coastal scenes are certainly not nationalistic. They certainly are decorative, but they're not purely decorative. I mean, they're also structural features in the composition. But beyond that, they signal an attraction to these areas precisely because they are where nationalities and cultures and languages mix, where France, in Ford's phrase, comes into England or vice versa. That is to say, rather than indicating nationalist isolationism, Alfred is waving lots of different flags to advocate mingling of nationality, a cosmopolitanism very like Ford's, I think, and like it because it's not only about cultural attitudes and lifestyles, but a sort of aesthetic internationalism too. Like Ford, Alfred felt at home in Kent because he could see it with European eyes and see Europe in it and through it. Thank you very much.
Max, thank you. That was as good as I thought it would be, which I will now tell you is saying something. Not to put too much pressure on you before you've even done it. Thank you so much. That was simply fabulous. I'm now going to open up the Padlet. Okay, I can see that we have our first question, but luckily, because somebody is still typing, I get to ask you one first. I'm sort of formulating, it's a kind of question-y, commenty thing, because I'm still thinking about it, but I was fascinated by what you said about, in both your subjects, the idea of dissection and alienation, but also immersion. And I love listening to people talk about art because I know nothing about it. So anything I say is going to be hopelessly naive. But I love the idea you talk about Alfred Cohen saying he has to isolate elements and then put them into component parts and create some kind of structure. And listen to that as a writer, because I was thinking, but that's what we do when we write poems. It's precisely that, is to isolate something, dissect it, and then somehow put it back together again. But I wondered how all this fits together. Is it a contradiction? Is it just a wonderful ambiguity that you talk about chemical that you're really immersed in, all that greenery, or all that hostile glaring? If someone, you interrupt someone cutting their hedge, that would still happen in Barron, I think. But what is there kind of tension there between that idea of being really immersed in something, but also feeling alien from it? And is that now necessary to the art that you're talking about? Do you have to have that dual perspective, a bit outside, but also really immersed in it?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating comment, Carolyn. Thanks very much. I think you're right. It's one of the phrases that used to come back to Alfred was, that sense of being on the outside of something looking in. And he particularly liked putting paintings behind glass. I think that feeling of sort of having a barrier between you and the work, which you could both see through but also be aware of, because you would see reflections on it and reflections of the viewer and things behind the viewer and so on. Creates a kind of distance and an awareness that what you're looking at is both a window sort of onto the world, but also an object that reflects things back at the viewer, including the viewer themselves. I mean, the other thing I'd want to say is that a lot of people looking at Alfred's pictures are made slightly uneasy by the freedoms he would take with topography. And I found it sort of really interesting thinking about his work in the context of Kent maps. And the wonderful variety of representations we've talked about today, including those brilliant children's drawings of maps, which really bring out how differently you can represent the place and the feelings for place. I think it's predominantly feelings Alfred is after in these landscapes, but also he does want something of the essence in the landscape. But you can very rarely identify an actual place. I mean, sometimes the places will be named, like Folkestone. I mean, that clearly is Folkestone. But doubtless you'll get someone who'll come and say, well, Folkestone doesn't really have that, that building in that position.
Yeah.
So he was quite prepared to rearrange the formal elements of a painting to make a better composition, even if it stopped being photographically realistic. But that would give him a distance from the actual place in order to immerse himself into the structure and the visual experience of it, and that's really what he was after, I think.
That's fascinating. And I mean that, I'm talking about something completely dissimilar, but I've been thinking a lot recently about how Dickens does that exact thing with Kent, and those of us who have been working on Dickens' The Maps, we think, but why does he do this? Why does he just move the landscape around, and why is everything a bit skewed when it doesn't need to be? And I think there is something more that it's certainly not laziness. It's and it's not necessary either. And I think there is, I don't know, almost a kind of perversity of the imagination sometimes that says I need to change this slightly to see it better. Something that it makes sense to me, but I couldn't articulate why anyone would do that. But I could see myself, if I were an artist, doing the same thing. Thinking, I need this building to be just slightly somewhere else, so that I would see properly, I think, by not looking at it quite as it was, but a bit differently. It's fascinating. I can see now, so the question from Kathy is now finished typing. Thank you for a wonderful talk, Max. You mentioned briefly the difficulty posed by the biographer of FMF because of his recreation experience, his recreation experience. So I love the English language, you don't notice you put it wrong. His recreation experience, the memories of others. What are the difficulties of writing about the life and art of someone as close as your stepfather?
I really love that question. In Ford's case, the difficulties sort of go even further than that. It's that he would fictionalize his own memories as well as other people's. So he had a reputation of being quite a liar in his lifetime. I mean, I think that's usually unfair. in that he's not trying to tell lies to fool anyone, but you know, rather, as I've been saying about Alfred changing the form of a landscape to make a better picture, Ford will change the details of an anecdote to make a better story, even if it's a story about himself and his own life or the lives of friends around him, and some of them predictably got annoyed by that. So that was a very specific kind of biographical difficulty, and I found as a critic what I was doing all the time was to try and find out why he was changing the story and how it made it work as a story, and why that was interesting, rather than just saying, you know, oh, we've caught Ford out lying yet again. We're writing about Alfred. I mean, that didn't come into it at all. He was he had an extraordinary memory. I mean, a very visual memory, but also an extraordinary memory for time. And I found most of the stories he told about his life are borne out by any research I've been doing on him. The problem really writing about him is that I'm too close to him and to the work to be an objective judge of it. I mean, I love the paintings and find it impossible not to express that. But when I'm writing about him or about his work, I just try and be as neutral as possible and as descriptive as possible. And luckily, you know, there are other people who've written about him and who've you know, written very appreciatively and analytically about the paintings, so it's possible to quote them and to discuss, you know, their ideas about him as well. But part of the point of wanting to, you know, put on exhibitions of his work for his centenary was to get it back into the public domain again, so other people can decide what they think about it. I mean, it's been great that it's been taken up by, you know, some nice public collections like the Sainsbury Centre and the Arts Council in recent years, who clearly think he's part of the story. I think one of the things that happened was that in the 1970s, when he carried on painting in this sort of still semi-abstract, semi-representational way, the art world just changed so dramatically, and pop art came in and conceptualism, and he wasn't doing that, and suddenly started looking rather old-fashioned. But now there's been a return of interest into figurative painting and the sort of mid-century, late 20th century painters who were pursuing that line. So it's a really interesting time in terms of reappraisals, and you know, we'll see what another generation makes of the work. But you know, I have to say I've really enjoyed sort of going back into that period of my life as well as his, and finding out much more about it, including the years in Kent, because I was very young at the time and I didn't know a lot of what was going on there, but I've only rediscovered it since. So it's been a kind of journey of discovery as well as a biography.
I think that idea of old-fashionedness is very interesting as well, because several of the papers have flagged up that what seems old-fashioned shortly after the event, a long time afterwards comes back as actually quite innovative and not behind the times, but ahead of its time. I'm thinking about the ecology in some of the literature. There's a message in Collaborate chat, which is not really a question, just so he's saying, I love the Folkestone painting. It feels very like Folkestone's coast to me. And she's a good local, so take it from her.
Thank you.
Any more questions? I'm aware that Max is having now full of snacks and probably quite happy, but nonetheless, I feel a responsibility to these people to make sure that he is able to feed them appropriately. So, does anybody have any more questions? I suspect, Max, there may be many emails coming your way after to say, yes, please, I would really like to come and see this exhibition, and asking you any more questions.
Yes, no, please do. And could I just ask Carolyn if it's still possible to show the last slides in the presentation, because one of them was of the book that's also available, and I would just like people to have a chance to see that if we can.
If I still have Kate with me, which I'm sure. Great.
So it's right at the end. Is it possible to jump?
Yeah. This one?
No, there's one after that, I think.
Oh,
well, there's the foundation, but there's even one after that. Sorry, the last one. That's the book. Yes.